Well, we've talked about Trojan horses and some virus concepts. How about let's get into the types of viruses? So let's start with our favorite one, ransomware. This has been making the rounds for a couple of years now, and the idea is that, assuming it's legitimate, because some ransomware is a hoax, that it actually will encrypt your whole drive, and then you'll get this message saying, you have to pay in bitcoins, otherwise we will never give you the key to decrypt. The problem, of course, is that you never know that you can actually truly trust them to decrypt this. There are a bunch of these: CryptoBit, CryptoLocker, CryptoDefense, CryptoWall, and other kinds of ransomware, like ones that claim that they're from the FBI or stuff like that. So if you see something like this, very, very common, ransomware. And you know, quite honestly, you shouldn't pay. You should not pay ransomware. That just encourages cyber criminals. Plus, there's no guarantee that they'll give you the key once you pay, or that the key will work. There's certainly not going to be any tech support on this. You're better off making sure that you have good backups of everything in a safe location. So if you ever get this, you can just flip them the bird and wipe out your machine and put your backed up data on. That is a far better overall mechanism. And we've seen too many companies that, out of desperation, because they didn't set themselves up properly to begin with, where they went ahead and they paid the ransomware, and you shouldn't do that. Types of viruses, all sorts. System or boot sector, meaning it infects the boot partition. File viruses, cluster viruses, multipartite, macro. So we're going to take a look at some of these in greater detail in just a second. Stealth tunneling, encryption, sparse infector, add-on, polymorphic, companion camouflage, intrusive, metamorphic, shell, direct action or transient, overriding file, file extension, terminate and stay resident. This goes back to the old DOS days here. Let's take a look at some of these in greater detail. Okay, so system or boot sector virus. So you know, when a computer boots up, the motherboard has a chip called the BIOS, Basic Input Output System. The BIOS's job, besides just kind of doing a quick diagnostic on the motherboard itself and like spin drives and count RAM and just send something in and out of ports to make sure all those basic functions are working. The BIOS's next job is to look at the disk and read the master boot record of the bootable drive, and then go to the partition boot sector, and each of these points ultimately down to the operating system, and hand control off to the starting files of whatever the OS is. The system and boot sector viruses can infect either of these parts of your hard drive. So what it does is a boot sector virus will move the master boot record. This is like in the very first sort of track on your drive in the inside ring. It'll move that to another location and copy itself, put itself in its place. And when this thing boots up, that virus is executed, and then the original master boot record is run. Which means then that if you have a master boot record infection, every bootable media that you plug in, like flash drives and floppy drives, although you probably don't have floppies, or removable drives, they also will get infected like this as well. File and multipartite viruses. File viruses are infect a specific file type: executable, syscom, PRG, BAT, etc. They can either just do something immediately and then be done, or they can stay memory resident. They can load themselves in memory and stay there. Multipartite is both file virus and this system boot sector virus. Macro virus, you've probably heard that term. If you have a Word document or an Excel document and you have these little macros, macro is just basically, I press a few keys and something is done. It's a shorthand way for Office document users to quickly get something done. It's just a little tiny bit of VB script, basically, in a document. But the fact that the script is executable means it can be infected. So a macro virus is written specifically to infect those little VBA code snippets that are part of Microsoft Word or Excel. And so they infect the template, and which then infects all the documents. And the documents appear to be normal, but there's something going on in the background. Cluster virus. So we modify directory table entries. So it'll point a user or a process to the virus rather than the actual application. And one copy of the virus is on the disk, but it infects all the applications on the computer. And it launches itself first. When you try to launch an app, it's launched first, and then it will launch the actual application itself. Stealth and tunneling viruses. These evade antivirus software by intercepting requests to the operating system. They basically intercept the antivirus software's request to read a file, and then they pass the request to the virus rather than the operating system. So in other words, when the antivirus is trying to check the file, it's talking to the virus who says, nothing to see here, we're all good. And the virus just says, oh, we're fine, see? Uninfected, no problem. And the antivirus goes away happy. Encryption viruses. So we will use simple encryption to encipher our virus, so to hide it. We were talking about that earlier. And we'll probably use a different key for every infected file. So if you manage to decrypt one file to clean it, you can't use the same key for others. The antivirus, of course, cannot directly detect this because the file's encrypted, so it can't tell what's going on. Polymorphic code. This is virus code that keeps changing. It keeps the original algorithm intact, but it keeps changing sort of its shape. It's a shapeshifter. And the virus has got to have some kind of mutating or polymorphic engine to allow it to do this. If this virus is written well, it's not going to leave any part of itself the same way with every virus infection. Metamorphic virus. It rewrites itself completely with every new infection. So it can reprogram itself by translating its own code into something else and then back to normal code. So it's a more advanced version of a polymorphic virus. You can have viruses that overwrite files or hide themselves in sort of like holes. A cavity virus will overwrite part of some kind of file that is constant. And what it does is when you look at a file, you'll be surprised at how much sort of free space is in the file. And it takes up those unused bits of space in that file. So it hides inside the cavity without making the file seeming to be any bigger. Sparse infector virus, it infects only once in a while, not every single time that an application runs. Or it infects only certain files of a certain size. It makes it harder for an antivirus program to detect it. Companion or camouflage virus, it stores itself in a file that has a similar name to a normal program file that you normally execute, such as Explorer exe. And when you execute that file, the virus will also run, and it will infect the computer or perform whatever steps it does, like deleting files. Shell virus, it wraps itself around some kind of code that already exists, like operating system code. And whenever a program tries to use the enclosed code, the virus is also executed. File extension virus. So these are things that change the extension to something that looks safe, like .txt. So especially if you turn on file extensions, if you hide known file extensions, you wouldn't know that files.txt is actually files.txt.vbs or .exe. And of course, this is a feature that we turn on or off in the operating system. You can have add-on and intrusive viruses. Add-on is I append my code to something else without making any changes to the host. And usually I put my code at the beginning. Or intrusive, I overwrite some of the host code, but not enough for anybody to notice. We also have transient and terminate and stay resident viruses. Transient, it just disappears after running. The opposite is the terminate and stay resident, TSR. Loads itself in memory, never leaves memory. It's always there. We also have fake viruses, hoaxes. They're false alarms. They claim like this is a phony. This is a phony ransomware claiming that we've actually done it. We haven't really, but they still want you to try to pay. And we can have fake antiviruses, which is an irritant. It'll pop up, usually in Windows, it'll pop up in the corner and say, "We found something. Click here to fix it." And so we can have fake viruses and fake antiviruses. What's a computer worm? It's a virus that doesn't need any help spreading. Once it has an infection, it will launch itself. It will ARP. It will attach itself to emails. It replicates on its own, spreading across the network without any human interaction or involvement. And most of them carry some kind of damaging payload, but they can also be used to install backdoors, turn you into a zombie, create botnets. Most viruses these days are worms. They're more sophisticated than simple viruses. So virus and worm, worms self-replicate, viruses don't. Worms do not attach themselves to other programs, they run on their own. They use like network features or file features to spread themselves automatically. Viruses don't do that. Viruses ride along inside of a document or another program. Types of worms, there's tons of them. And there are worm makers, in fact, as well. So that is a look at the types of viruses and worms.